Good afternoon to everybody. And the noise may be coming from my area. It's 6 a.m. where I am in Athens. So I'm in a cafeteria, which is very nicely allowing me to have the video now. And I hope that I can be heard. I want to thank you for inviting me and thank SHAPE for its leadership. And I just had the privilege to listen to Alison Brainovsky and Chung-In Moon. And these are brilliant statements that we've all been treated with. Absolutely insightful. I absolutely agree with all that has been said. The world has gone mad. But especially the Anglo-Saxon world, I'm afraid. I don't know whether there is any sense at all in our little English-speaking corner of the world. I'm, of course, speaking of the United States, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. There's something profoundly disheartening about the politics of our countries right now. The deep madness, I'm afraid, is British imperial thinking taken over by the United States. My country, the US, is unrecognizable now compared even to 20 or 30 years ago. I'm not sure, to tell you the truth, who runs the country. I do not believe it is the President of the United States right now. We are run by generals, by our security establishment. The public is privy to nothing. The lies that are told about foreign policy are daily and pervasive by a mainstream media that I can barely listen to or read anymore. The New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and the main television outlets are 100% repeating government propaganda by the day. And it's almost impossible to break through. What is this about? Well, as you've heard, it's about a madness of the United States to keep U.S. hegemony. Militarized, dominated by the thinking of generals who are mediocre intellects, personally greedy, and without any sense, because their only modus operandi is to make war. And then cheerled by Britain, which is unfortunately in my adult life increasingly pathetic in being a cheerleader for the United States for this hegemony and for war. Whatever the US says, Britain will say it 10 times more enthusiastically. And it could not love more the war in Ukraine, which is the great second Crimean War for the British media and for the British political leadership. Now, how Australia and New Zealand fall for this idiocy is really a deep question for you, because people should know better, but I'm afraid that it is the Five Eyes and the security establishment that tell the politicians, to the extent that the politicians are involved in this, well, this is how we have to do it. This is our security state. And I don't think our politicians necessarily have much role in this. By the way, the public has no role at all in U.S. foreign policy, at all. We have no debate, no discussion, no deliberation, no debates over voting the 113 billion, but in fact much more money spent on the Ukraine war so far. There's not been an hour of organized debate, even in the Congress, on this, much less in the public. But my guess is that your security establishment is really the driver of this. And then they explained to the prime minister and to the others, this is the utmost national security, and this is what America has told us, and let me explain what we're seeing. And of course, you cannot divulge this to the broader public, but this is at the essence of the struggle for survival in the world. Everything I see myself, I'm 43 years in this activity as an economic advisor all over the world, is nonsense. And one thing that would be interesting for people to look at to understand these developments is a very telling article by a former colleague of mine at Harvard, Robert Blackwell, and Ashley Tellis, written for the Council on Foreign Relations about 8 years ago now. I just want to read a couple excerpts from it because it laid out the whole plan of what's happening right now pretty directly, which is how things work in the US, which is through the establishment media, you're basically told in not necessarily completely explicit terms what's going to happen, because what is unfolding right now is really part of a longer term planned agenda. It's not ad hoc. So here's what Blackwell and Tellis wrote in 2015. First, quote, "Since its founding, the United States has consistently pursued a grand strategy focused on acquiring and maintaining preeminent power over various rivals, first on the North American continent, then in the Western Hemisphere, and finally globally." And then argues that this goal of primacy ought to remain the central objective of U.S. grand strategy in the 21st century. So what's the goal? The goal is very straightforward. It is primacy of the United States globally. Then Blackwell and Tellis lay out the game plan for China. So they tell us what to do. Here's the list. I'm only excerpting. Quote, "Create new preferential trading arrangements among U.S. friends and allies to increase their mutual gains through instruments that consciously exclude China." Okay, this is the game that already Obama started with TPP. He couldn't get it through, but I'll go on and then I'll comment. Second, create a technology control regime to block China's strategic capabilities, to build up, quote, "power political capacities of U.S. friends and allies on China's periphery," and strengthen U.S. military forces along the Asian rimlands, despite any Chinese opposition. What I find remarkable about this is this was a list made in 2015. It's exactly the step-by-step plan of action. This is repeated in recent history. In 1997's Big Brzezinski, in an article in Foreign Affairs, laid out exactly the timeline for NATO enlargement and the intention to include Ukraine in NATO enlargement, because this was already the security establishment plan. Of course, it's led us directly to the Ukraine war, which is a war over NATO enlargement. Now the friends that have, and the geniuses that have brought the world the Ukraine war, want to bring the war to your neighborhood with as Professor Moon said, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization starting to open its offices in Asia, which is not exactly the North Atlantic. So this is where we are. It's not absolutely simple to see through for one main reason, at least in the US. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but I expect that it's the same. We have no honesty or discussion at all about this. The policies are owned entirely by the security establishment, the military-industrial complex, the network of, quote, think tanks, which are non-think tanks in Washington, every one of which is funded by the military-industrial complex. They've taken over the East Coast universities entirely, where I teach. I taught 20 years at Harvard. I teach at Columbia University. This is our milieu right now. And the silent coup happened in essence. No debate, no public politics, no honesty, no documents revealed, everything secret, everything confidential, and mysterious moves. And since I happen to be an economist that engages with heads of state around the world, I hear a lot of things. And so I've seen and heard a lot of things directly, which help me to understand the lies every day. But you will not find any of this in our public discourse. Just a word about the Ukraine war. Completely predictable and part of a plan of action that goes back to the early 1990s to essentially bring Ukraine into the US military orbit. And Brzezinski, again in 1997 in the Global Chessboard, his geopolitical book, laid it out completely. Russia without Ukraine is nothing. Ukraine is the geographical pivot for Eurasia, and basically go get it. Interestingly, Brzezinski said in 1997 in the book, but the one thing absolutely American policymakers need to ensure is that they don't push Russia and China into an alliance together. But then he says, that's pretty much unthinkable. Don't worry about that, but that would be the craziest thing in the world. And it's exactly what these crazy people have done. I happen to have been an advisor to Gorbachev, to Yeltsin, and to Kuchma in the early days of both the late days of perestroika and the early days after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I watched very closely what was happening. I saw that the United States was absolutely uninterested in any way in helping Russia to stabilize. The idea from the start was unipolarity, keep Russia down, and take steps already decided in 1992, basically, in direct contradiction to what had been told to Gorbachev and Yeltsin to start expanding NATO. So this is a game plan with a long horizon. When it comes to China, and by the way, the U.S. was deeply implicated in the overthrow of Ukraine's president in 2014. It was a coup. It was to an important extent a regime change operation of the United States, not entirely, but to a very significant extent. I happen to see part of it in a very weird way up close, and I know how U.S. money poured into supporting the Maidan, and it was incredibly disgusting and very unnerving, and Putin noticed that the U.S. contributed to the overthrow of a friendly government next door, in the context of the explicit intention to push NATO, by the way, not only to Ukraine, but also to Georgia. And when one looks at the map, it's Brzezinski's idea: surround Russia in the Black Sea region. Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia would all be members of NATO. That would be the end of Russian power projection in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. So go these geniuses. And Putin gave many opportunities for negotiation out of this. The Minsk agreements endorsed by the UN Security Council in 2021, December 17, he put on the table a perfectly reasonable document for negotiation, the draft US-Russia security arrangements, which called for an end to NATO expansion. The US blew it off. I called the White House after that was put on the table, spoke to one of our top security officials, and said, negotiate. Stop the NATO enlargement. You have a chance to avoid war. The United States' formal response to Putin was, NATO is non-negotiable. This is something only between the US and Ukraine, and Russia has no say in NATO enlargement to Ukraine. It's a mind-boggling way to pursue foreign affairs because it is a direct road to war. As you know, I hope everybody understands, this war in Ukraine was close to ending in March 2022 with a negotiated agreement a month after Russia invaded on February 24th, with an agreement between Ukraine and Russia that the United States stopped because the US said, fight on, don't negotiate, don't accept neutrality. And so here we are in a war that continues to escalate towards possible nuclear war, which is what would happen if Russia were to suffer deep defeats on the battlefield. It's not doing that right now. It's not experiencing that. But if it did, it just escalates to nuclear war. Russia is not going to be defeated, pushed out of Crimea, and go home meekly and saying, we're sorry we did that. It's going to escalate if it needs to escalate. So we are right now in a spiral that is extremely dangerous. Japan plays utterly into this. And Australia, it's so sad to watch Australia in a accepting to be used in this reckless way, to pay a fortune to be used in this reckless and provocative way. And US actions, by and large, till now, with very few exceptions, US actions are putting us on a path to war with China in the same way that US actions did in Ukraine. Only this war, well, but either war could end everything. But the whole idea of the US and its allies fighting China is mind-boggling in its implications, in its stupidity, in its profound dangers, and in its utter divorce from real security interests and from reality, because China is not a threat to Australia. It is not a threat to the world. And last time I looked, correct me because there's some experts in the room, many more than I, but I don't know of a single overseas Chinese invasion in its history, by the way, other than on the borders. I don't know in its whole history, except when the Mongols briefly ruled China and tried to invade Japan. Other than the Mongol invasion, defeated by a typhoon, other than that, I don't know of another single case in 2,200 years of Chinese statecraft. So this is not exactly at the top of my worry list. This is what worries me about the world is a deeply neurotic United States that aims to be number one, that can't be number one in the way that it self-believes to be number one, that has a pathetic, and I'm sorry to use the term, but it is pathetic, cheerleader in London every day saying how wonderful it is. Empire is great. You should go try it. We love it.
Jeffrey,
I'm going to stop here. Sorry to go on and on, but let me just, if I could, 1 minute to say what should be done. The war in Ukraine could end the day after Biden steps up and says NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine. Believe it. The basis for negotiation has been there for 20 years and rejected by the US. Second, the idea of opening NATO offices in Asia is mind-boggling in its risk and it's stupidity. And please tell the Japanese, stop this. It's reckless. Third, the U.S. approach to Taiwan, except in a glimmer of reality of Blinken last month, is profoundly dangerous, provocative, and deliberately so. Fourth, what is needed is regional dialogue in Asia, among Asians and among the Asia Pacific. And fifth, use RCEP, because RCEP is actually the correct concept for the region, to bring together China, Korea, Japan, ASEAN, Australia, and New Zealand in a coherent framework, especially around the climate challenge, energy policy, trade policy, investment policy, would do a world of good, not only for the 15 in the Asia Pacific, but for the entire world. Sorry to have run on so long and to ramble, but it's so important what SHAPE is doing. You're completely on the right track, and all best wishes to your efforts.
History of the last 250 years misshaped our understanding in a way. It gave the idea that the world is led by the West, naturally. Well, this is completely non-historical. It's a specific moment of history, or rather astounding moment, because the steam engine, mechanization, the factory world, industrialization, the atomic age, this was led by the West. And so the technological impulse was so strong, the dynamism was so strong, the military advantage was so strong that the British Empire ruled the oceans. And then after 2 world wars, at the end of 1945, Britain was exhausted and handed the leadership to the United States, basically, or the US grabbed the baton. And the US thought, now we run the world. After 1991, when the Soviet Union ended, the American mindset was, now we really run the world. No competitors, no nothing, because we had one competitor, the Soviet Union. It doesn't even exist anymore. And they didn't even imagine. If you look back in the early 1990s, China wasn't mentioned. China, that's villages. They grow rice. What do we have to do with that? So they had no idea what was going to happen over the next 30 years, that China was going to have the most phenomenal catching up. And China, by 2010, had developed a real middle-income country. But then China started to innovate. Now, this was something completely unexpected. Starting around 2015, China's suddenly at the frontier of innovation in many, many areas. And then the US policymakers said, wait, that's not in our script. We run the world. What's this China business? This is where the problem lies right now. We don't have an understanding of this. The US still talks about, well, we need a world in which we run the world because of our Western values. Well, China does not want the United States to run the world. China, I believe, wants to cooperate. I do not believe, based on all I know about China and all I know about 2,200 years of Chinese history since the unification of China, that China has any aspiration to go conquer the world or threaten Greece or threaten the United States. I don't believe it at all. It's a long story, but I don't believe it at all. I think we need to learn to live together. Now, if you think about this multipolar order, India is now developing very fast. It's now the most populous country because it overtook, according to the best data we have, China earlier this year. Africa, if you consider it a union rather than 54 separate countries, it's the same population, 1.4 billion, as India and as China. Each one is going to be a center of world polarity, of civilization. Latin America, which has been very divided and very unhappy experience, has a lot of people, a huge region, huge resources needed for the world. So I'm looking for a world in which North America, South America, Europe, European Union, African Union, the Arab region, Russia, Central Asia, South Asia, East Asia, actually work within the regions peacefully and cooperate across the regions, rather than all this talk about, will we have a new war between China and the US? Aside from the fact that it would quite possibly end the world, what a waste of time to talk about war when we have climate change to attend to, when we have technological change to attend to, when we have serious work to do for human well-being. What are they talking about? Why are we spending $2.2 trillion on armaments right now? Why is my country, the United States, spending 40% of all the arms purchases in the world, or military spending? We're 40% of the worldwide $2.2 trillion. That is awful, because inside the United States, we've got poverty, we've got falling life expectancy, we've got mass shootings almost every day. So what are they talking about war? How about fixing inside the United States?
How do you see the U.S. strategy towards China?
I think the U.S. strategy towards China is a complete blunder by people who I suspect have never been to China and who know no history. The mindset of the U.S., and when I say the U.S., I mean the security establishment. The mindset of the U.S. security establishment is China's a threat, and we need to make sure that we remain dominant over China. That's quite an idea, because China's 4 times larger than the United States. But they got the idea starting around 2015. We need to hinder China's development. They won't put it that way, because governments have stories. No, we don't want to hurt you. But what they really want to do is slow China's development. They want to keep high technology away. The Chinese have figured that out, that this is not goodwill. This is not simply about arms, because if it were about armaments, we'd have arms control discussions. This is about competition. Who's number one? As an economist, frankly, I don't think in those terms, because we want prosperity in both places, from my point of view. But if you're a security leader, apparently your biggest thought is who's number one and who's below you, which to my mind is a strange way to think about the world anyway, but that is the mindset. So the US has made many unilateral moves, very strange ideas. President Obama already, and he's one of our more rational leaders, he started negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership with the explicit idea, let's have a trading arrangement in Asia with the United States that doesn't include China. What kind of thinking is that? So I think the US approach has been wrong. And one of the things about Chinese statecraft, just like Confucianism, by the way, Confucian was a lot about ritual and proper relationship. And ritual mattered in that you need to give proper respect.
On China, are you concerned for a possible conflict on the relations, on the United States relation with China? Emmanuel Macron, the French president, said recently that the Europeans and France should not follow the United States when it comes to Taiwan.
Europe needs a foreign policy. This is no secret. Europe doesn't have a foreign policy right now. Europe has a NATO policy, which means a US policy. Frankly, the Europeans don't care, is the US number one or China number one? It's not the European interest. The idea of this number one is a comic book version of the world. It's not the real version of the world. But the US is actually aiming to implicate Europe in the US contest with China. This is bad for the economy and bad for security of Europe. And even worse, and I resent it also as an American, the US began to invite Asian leaders to NATO. The last time I looked, NATO meant North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It did not mean Pacific. and it should not be involved in Asian affairs. All this does is put Europe deeper and deeper into geopolitical strife that is not Europe's cause, it's not Europe's purpose, it's not Europe's interest.
On the war in Ukraine, you're very critical about the United States foreign policy. You're at the same time critical for the Russian brutal invasion. Do you see any prospects for peace and a way out soon?
If one looks at this conflict objectively, which is very hard to do because we're not getting an objective account, we have an incredible war of attrition and bloodshed in Ukraine, which is first and foremost killing Ukraine. All of this great talk about, oh, we're going to drive Russia out of, every inch, including Crimea and so forth, never made any sense, never had any truth to it, was guaranteed to put Ukraine into violence, war, and bloodshed for years to come. And frankly, at age 68, as I am, and I've lived through Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, the Contra Wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Serbia, and now Ukraine, enough. Go sit and negotiate. That's my feeling.
In the United States, next year in 2024, we're going to have presidential elections. It seems that so far we're going to have the main candidates are President Biden, who is going to be next year 82. He does a good job right now at the White House, but he's going to be 82. And on the Republican side, Donald Trump. We all know Donald Trump, and we experienced his presidency. How come the American system cannot have another dynamic leader, another dynamic candidate that could inspire people in the world?
I think there's a very sad truth right now about the United States, which friends of the United States don't want to hear, but it's true, and that is we have been unable to solve internal problems in the U.S. for decades now. We can't get agreement on anything. We can't get agreement on taking care of our kids. We can't get agreement on guns. We can't get agreement on any issue at all. Our politics is wrecked. It was wrecked actually by corruption, first and foremost by big money, because next year's presidential campaign will probably spend $15 billion at least. So you see all these billionaires lining up. Well, I'll give this one to the Democrats, this one to the Republicans, but they're billionaires. What do they want? They want low taxes and no environmental regulation. So the general problem in the United States is the political system is generally dysfunctional and corrupted. Biden, in my opinion, has no business running again. I'm sorry. An 81-year-old who will be 82 and 86 if he were to be reelected, and he's not in great shape, in my view. I'm no doctor or expert, but I'm watching him. Retire. Thank you very much. Time to move on. Let a new generation come in. And Trump will have so many lawsuits by the time this thing comes. It's stunning how sad this is. So I believe that one other experience of American presidential politics is you never know. If you have two lead candidates, one of whom is being indicted left and right, and the other is really fumbling physically right now in many different contexts, I think we have to wait and see who the real candidates are going to be next year. But in any event, the whole system is not working well, and unfortunately the U.S. Has been unable to sit down and discuss internally how we make our politics work better.
Mm-hmm. Finally, some experts on global challenges include the use of technologies, new technologies, the AI, that might disrupt the world if are not these technologies properly used. Are you concerned?
We should really be concerned. First, amazed, is number one. Second, in many ways admiring. But then third, deeply concerned about the technological revolutions underway. It's not only AI, it's science, and even more than science, technology has exploded in all sorts of advances. You can see in the Ukraine war every day, this is not a war even like you would have seen a year or 2 or 3 years ago, but it's across society right now, whether it's computation, whether it's connectivity, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's robotics, whether it's advanced biotechnology, and on and on. So you realize these technologies are out of control. Some people want to make trillions of dollars out of them. Some people want to blow up the world with them. Some people want to make biowarfare with them. Nobody can govern them. And this is a huge problem. And the problems are 3. 1, almost nobody understands what's going on. If we're not technically led through this, and it took me months to really understand a lot of this, and I was working real hard at it. It's very hard, so very concentrated knowledge. Second problem is power coming from this. Knowledge is power, said Francis Bacon in 1605. Whether it's military power, financial power, they don't want to tell us what's going on. They've got the power. And the third problem, and it's related to this, at least in the US context, all serious governance is secret right now. So to come back to Greek democracy, you know, the Athenians went to the Agora, or went to the Acropolis, or went to the assembly, and they heard the arguments. People discussed them. Pericles gave his lectures. Didn't always work out perfectly, but things were discussed. In America right now, almost nothing is discussed. We have narrative, we don't have deliberation. Narrative is what the government wants us to believe, and the New York Times, I'm afraid, or the Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal prints with unnamed senior officials. I happen to be, because of my jobs and role in life, I happen to be privy to a lot more discussion than you can find in the media. They're lying all the time. I don't like that, because how are we going to have a democracy if it's not based on transparency and truth? US and Western craziness, boneheadedness, it wasn't even the decisive factor in this, because even when Putin came into power, he was absolutely pro-European. There's no doubt about it. And I know many European leaders that dealt closely with him, friends of mine, people who are absolutely wonderful leaders, who said, of course, he was extremely cooperative. So even with all of the blunders, which were terrible mistakes, even in the early 2000s, this could have been rectified. But this plan of NATO enlargement was so relentless. There was Victoria Nuland at every step, by the way. That's the amazing where's Waldo kind of thing, because she is the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cheney. Then she's the U.S. ambassador to NATO. Then she's the spokesperson for the State Department for Hillary Clinton. Then she's the Assistant Secretary of State on the Maidan. Now she's the Undersecretary of State. So if there's one person who personifies the constant thread of this, it's Nuland. But this could have been avoided so many times. You know, if one tries to interpret, I'm trying to interpret this craziness, because there were so many warnings. Don't try this at home. Don't do this. By our leading, you know, our greatest diplomat, George Kennan, was extremely clear, of course. Bill Burns, our CIA director, who was the ambassador to Russia in 2008, wrote an absolutely vivid memo. Niet means niet. Of course, like everything, Alexander, and I think this is part of the point, everything is secret except that one showed up on WikiLeaks. Yeah. So the public hears nothing about the debates, not a word. and our dumb newspapers, not a word except whatever the government tells them to say. And so in 2008, my view is they just couldn't believe that they wouldn't get away with whatever they wanted. First, the Orange Revolution. Okay, we'll just get it through with Yushchenko as president. Didn't quite work out. Then NATO. Okay, we'll do that. Then came Yanukovych. How the hell did he become president again? Now we have neutrality again. That was unacceptable. Then they thought, okay, we can dump him. We can overthrow him. And there was Victoria Nuland handing out cookies on the Maidan, and I happened to catch a glimpse of this myself, and it was disgusting, the U.S. role in the violent overthrow of Yanukovych. But they thought they could get away with it, that a new government would come in and then it would start. And they believed until the end, I'm quite convinced, that Putin was bluffing, that he would never launch a military effort against NATO enlargement, that in the end he would back down, we'll see him through the bluff. And when he did launch the special operation in February 24th, 2022, he did it with the view, in my opinion, that Ukraine would come to the negotiating table quickly, that this was basically to get the negotiations that the United States had rejected at the end of 2021. And indeed, immediately Zelensky said, yeah, we could be neutral. We just need security guarantees. A pretty basic point, by the way. That was the last lucid moment of Zelensky. I don't know what his private attitudes are, but it was the last statement that he made of any honesty, in my opinion, about the fate of Ukraine. He said, we can be neutral. We need security guarantees. This fighting should stop. And then we know it almost did stop until the United States stopped the stopping of the war by intervening and saying, don't you dare agree to negotiate. So they continued their fantasy world that Putin's at an end. He'll never mobilize. And our sanctions will kill him. And everything is bluff, in my opinion, and tremendous miscalculation, because these people are not very bright and they do not calculate the next move. And they have no understanding of the move on the other side. And so this is why there's no negotiation, because they can't think. They keep thinking whatever they read in the newspaper, which is, by the way, whatever the government has told the newspaper to publish. So they believe their own press releases, which is astounding because the press releases are so obviously phony. So it seems to me, the conclusion of all of this is, if it's right that they've run out of ammunition, this is what we're going to find out. This is probably the only fact that is going to actually determine something. And it's sad to say, because this was so utterly avoidable for 30 years. This was utterly avoidable for the last 2 years. It could have been stopped in March 2022. It could have been stopped in Vilnius last week. And there been a shred of honesty. And by the way, I can tell you two gentlemen that I had, and I won't say more than what I'm going to say, but I had a talk with a brief talk, but a substantive talk with one of Europe's leaders. And I expressed my views, and I was told, you're exactly right. And then the same leader said exactly the opposite at Vilnius. So, you watch this close up, and people are dying. It's unbelievable.
Yes.
It's unbelievable that we can't be honest long enough to sit down and stop the killing and make the politics to stop the killing, because it's not that hard. The amazing thing is how much diplomacy is taking place, just not with the United States. Actually, we're in a remarkable flurry of diplomacy. Russia and China, the BRICS countries,
UN Security Council meetings going overtime, dozens of speakers yesterday at the open session of the UN Security Council. But the United States is not part of any of this diplomacy. The United States essentially absented itself from diplomacy many years ago when it thought under tremendous delusions that diplomacy was not needed because it was the indispensable country, the sole superpower, the country that all nations of the world look to. By the way, all the tropes repeated in that god-awful speech by Biden last week, showing how completely out of date he is, obviously, in many ways. So there's a lot of diplomacy. The world is shifting before our eyes in very dangerous ways, I might add, some positive in that voices are being heard that have not been heard for a very long time. But the U.S. basically, as you said, and I think is exactly right, the U.S. Leadership is non-existent, doesn't get it, and is so out of experience of diplomacy, they literally do not know who to talk to. And no one especially wants to talk to them. They want some cooperation from the U.S. The U.S. has stood alone now in the UN Security Council. This is very notable, actually, when you essentially have 14 countries aligned against one that exercises a veto. That also, from a foreign policy and diplomatic point of view, doesn't stand. And Israel is, of course, in an absolutely self-destructive mode right now. Not only doubling down on a horrendous and illegal action against civilians in Gaza, but dramatically raising the stakes. The Israeli government calling for the Secretary General, who is doing a remarkable job in trying to help the world find a way through this, calling on the Secretary General to resign. It's unbelievable how Israel is saying, we'll go against the world. Thinking as Netanyahu has, well, the United States has our back, but the U.S. has nobody's back anymore. And all of this, therefore, is one miscalculation built on the next.
I have to say, I completely agree. I think the decision to call for the UN Secretary General's resignation was a serious mistake. Criticize him, by all means. Criticism is fine. But to actually call for his resignation after he made some very some statements about, observing international humanitarian law and not committing war crimes and trying to put some kind of historical context into all of this. I thought that was most extreme. Now, I have to say, I think that Israel's policy becomes understandable given what you said about the fact that the Israelis have been led to believe for many, many years that they have America at their back, that the Americans have in effect brought Israel to this point. I'm not acquitting the Israelis of any mistakes that they themselves have made, but if you're constantly supported in whatever you do by the world's most powerful country, eventually your own diplomatic skills start to atrophy because you don't need diplomatic skills anymore, or at least that is what you start to think. And I get the sense that the Israelis themselves, seeing this situation, one of the reasons they're reacting in the way they are is because they themselves are beginning to become nervous. That is my own response to what happened in the Security Council yesterday.
I think everybody is becoming nervous, but they have no alternative gears. They have no mechanism now. They have absolutely destroyed diplomacy over the years because of this idea, this basically false idea that the United States has propounded, that it will get its way and those backed by the United States will get their way. And this is of course the deep link of the Ukraine crisis and the Israel-Palestine crisis. They both are the result of massive failures of diplomacy predicated on the same idea that you can, in the case of Ukraine, of course, the U.S. has our back. We will join NATO. What can Russia do? And in the case of Israel, we don't have to speak with the Palestinians for decades. Basically, everything is fine and quiet. And, we knew Jake Sullivan's remarkable demonstration of delusion in his statement a couple of weeks ago that the Middle East is quieter than it has been in decades. But when you get my issue of foreign affairs arrived in the mail yesterday, and I didn't realize it was in print. So the lead story of this central journal of American foreign policy has the Middle East is quieter than it has been for decades. In the pullout quote in the front article, you show we are absolutely like the cartoon character that has run off the cliff, didn't realize there was no ground below, is sitting in the air for one split moment, and then boom, and that is what we are experiencing right now before our eyes. And whether they have some adjustment is a little bit doubtful as well, because the president is too old for this. Obviously, is too unequipped mentally for this from the point of view of his mindset built over decades. Netanyahu is as destructive and divisive as any leader of Israel has been, even before this crisis. And so there is no leadership. The United States, of course, doesn't even have a functioning Congress right now. Our government will be on the verge of another shutdown crisis within another couple of weeks. So this is a situation where there is no evident capacity to adjust to any of this by the U.S. But let me say again, what does impress me as a possibility is the rest of the world actually finding its feet in this, because it is gathering diplomatically. China is proposing steps in the Middle East which are going to be listened to. China will chair the UN Security Council in the month of November. That will be a notable occasion for a worldwide consultation with or without the United States. So events are not completely desperate and hopeless, but they are extraordinarily dangerous. This is, to be sure, this is obvious.
Can I just ask quickly, Professor Sachs? We're hearing lots of reports about people within the US government becoming extremely worried. There was that article in the Financial Times that there's people in the State Department who are worried, that there's stories that staffers in Congress are getting worried too. Have you picked up any sign of this? Because these are all rumors that we're hearing off stage, but we've seen nobody actually come forward and propose alternatives or say anything that seems to break from the consensus at the moment.
It's very interesting. The short answer is no, but the reason is that foreign policy really has become a cabal. We've not had a debate in public about U.S. foreign policy throughout the entire Ukraine crisis because it's tightly held by the White House, the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, and we know the very few top people involved. We don't hear from the diplomats more generally. We have basically heard from Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, Newland, and Lloyd Austin. Those are the faces of this. Congress did not debate any of these issues. Now Congress is completely dysfunctional. Interestingly, as you know, the American public opinion was moving rather strongly against Biden's Ukraine policy, but it's amazing how the policies towards the Middle East have also undergone a massive sea change. We're seeing a break of U.S. support for Israel. We're seeing a generational change that's quite dramatic. Young people are basically utterly divided on this. The campuses in the United States are utterly divided in this. What we also understand very clearly is that all of this caught the Washington leaders, if you can use a term that sounds almost like an oxymoron in this, because there are no leaders, but unaware of the world, seeing the changing understanding in the world. Jake Sullivan's quotation is not only a huge embarrassment and a reflection of a complete unawareness of ground reality, but is a measure of how the U.S. Leaders talk themselves into a view that they don't have to talk to anybody to gauge anything. So all of this is that we don't hear anything more than what we glean. I don't hear anything more from what we glean in these tidbits, but I think that that's because there are not deep processes of debate and reflection. There is a collapse of an approach before our eyes and not really an alternative process in play. And Biden is not the kind of, he doesn't have the capacity of a John F. Kennedy to convene leaders and think through a deep crisis like this. They just don't even exist anywhere in Washington right now.
Can you discuss the United Nations? Because it seems to me that one of the most interesting things about this crisis is that it is beginning to center increasingly on the United Nations. Lula and Putin spoke the day before yesterday, and they're coordinating positions on the Security Council. Putin and Erdogan spoke yesterday, and they're again coordinating positions on the Security Council. The Chinese spoke to both. The Chinese foreign minister called and spoke to both the foreign ministers of Israel and Palestine. Again, you're absolutely correct. Lots of diplomatic activity going on, and it is centered on the security on the United Nations. I get this impression. I very much get the impression that the United States government doesn't take the UN as seriously as it should, and doesn't realize that this is where opinion is going to crystallize, and that it really does risk being outmaneuvered in the United Nations.
This is exactly right. One of the essential points of this U.S. arrogance over the last 30 years was the very clear determination of the United States not to let the nuisance of the United Nations get in the way of U.S. policy at any moment. And that has been true of this administration as well as past administrations. But the rest of the world is seeing the essential role of the institutions of the United Nations, the UN Security Council, and I will say the General Assembly, because as you've been pointing out many times, the General Assembly is going to find its voice on this crisis. There is a process uniting for peace, actually due to Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State and senior poobah of American foreign policy in the Truman era and Kennedy era, which was a doctrine for very different purposes, but it said if there's a complete bottleneck or gridlock or veto in the UN Security Council that blocks action, events will move to the UN General Assembly. This is, I think, likely to happen here unless the United States finally realizes that the path that it's on is a complete dead end for everybody, and including for the U.S. to have any role and say, meaning that if the U.S. continues to veto action in the Security Council, it will go to the General Assembly, and we'll find that the world is deeply aligned for peace, for a ceasefire, for a solution to the Palestinian crisis, that is statehood for Palestine. And this will be also a geopolitical earthquake, actually, because I think that the clear shifting lines of the world will become even more clear in ways that are being exposed by the Ukraine and Israel-Palestine crisis right now, but are going to become even more vivid. By the way, if we survive this without terrible devastation, there is a lot of good that can come from this because it is possible to see a multipolar world not only de facto in place, but also de jure in the sense of under the UN Charter and under international law, actually a clear change to a world in which the voice of the world will be heard and determinative in ways that it has not been during this illusory unipolar period of the United States. So maybe we're actually moving to something where global rule of law could actually take shape. But I think, not so sorry to be long-winded on all of this, but the point is that this is a crisis that has not led to people saying, oh, why do we care about the UN? How useless. Quite the contrary. What we're seeing is virtually all nations of the world, other than the US and Israel, coming forward and saying we need solutions that abide by the UN Charter and that are under the responsibility of the UN Security Council. So it has not been the abandonment of international law, but an increased recognition that that's exactly what we need. And because China is very much in that direction, and Russia is seeking this also, and Russian diplomacy put forward the first attempt at a ceasefire, and this was an extremely constructive move. I think that there is really a move with Brazil also very important in its own right, very important because of President Lula's leadership, but also the next president of the G20, where the key underlying economic decisions are going to be taken that will be the fallout of all of these events. This is a changing world before our eyes.
I completely agree. I think one of the things that I've noticed also is that you're seeing all of these comments made around the world, including by ASEAN. This is not being noticed, but they're to some extent perhaps more detached from this, but they've made some very clear statements. And they are talking about international law and the United Nations. They are not talking about this rules-based international order that people in the West talk about. That seems to be of no interest to them at all. It is international law as classically understood, centered on the United Nations, based on the Charter of the United Nations, that countries outside the West are converging around. What do you make of all of these enormous military build-ups? Because I think that my own view about this is that this has been excessive and hugely unwise and has added to the tension, and nobody knows exactly what its purpose is. I mean, does the United States itself fully understand the extent to which these huge military deployments have made the situation in the Middle East even more tense and even more dangerous than it might otherwise have been?
Well, when we say the United States, of course, again, we have to think specifically about the personalities involved. And the answer is the leadership is extraordinarily weak. The president is extraordinarily weak in all of this, aged, out of date, with a wrong approach to foreign policy from the day he stepped into office, a promoter of the neoconservative U.S. leadership, indispensable nation ideas for decades. So in this sense, I think the risks of miscalculation are absolutely profound. And I'm sorry to say it, this is a trite point, but an absolutely true one. The possibilities of terrible accidents are extremely grave. We know that American troops are being shot at right now, and we don't know the truth about this, but the war is already spreading right now. We know that there have been attacks in Syria and in Iraq. We don't know, I don't know, at least the details of this at all. There is a tremendous amount of violence, a tremendous amount of hotheads. Netanyahu is certainly one of the most irresponsible politicians on the world scene, and has been for a long time. He profoundly divided his own country, which is absolutely spiraling into a deeper and deeper crisis. We have statements that are intemperate, doesn't even begin to describe the vulgarity of the statements coming out of some of the Israeli hardliners right now. And in these circumstances, terrible things can happen. That's why the leadership of the UN Secretary General right now is so important, and I think has been remarkable, I must add, and why calm voices from the Chinese leaders is very much appreciated, from Lula, from others. This is needed to help stabilize what is truly an explosive brew right now. And in terms of whether the American leaders understand this, clearly they don't. They're scrambling like mad. They are operating on premises that are completely wrong, and it would take a lot of learning in a short period of time, and bureaucracies also don't learn much. Leaders can make an individual difference, but it would be surprising to me for Biden to rise to the occasion, frankly.
I'm going to speak briefly about other countries. I think I have been very impressed again by the sophistication Brazil is bringing to bear in this crisis, and I have to say I'm deeply dismayed by the fact that Europe is nowhere to be seen. I mean, we are not doing anything remotely useful or constructive in this crisis at all. As I can see, there's divisions and there's arguments about the behavior of the president of the European Commission and the role that she has played. But no European government of importance seems to be rising to this situation or acting to calm things. So we see Brazil, which has not been active in diplomacy in the past, is now playing a positive and creative role. And Europe, where diplomacy was born, modern diplomacy was born, is just absented itself entirely.
It's completely stunning. Of course, van der Leyen long ago mortgaged the European Commission to NATO, and maybe even to her personal quest to become the next Secretary General of NATO, though that's a footnote of no special significance. But she has been terrible during this Ukraine crisis, and now completely lost in the current events. Europe itself, of course, is very, and not to say Germany, of course, probably the weakest and most misguided and often loudmouthed foreign ministers that we have, and Germany
inherently, because of history, can't really do anything constructive on this. France, whoa, just strangeness coming out of Macron's words. I mean, absolutely bizarre from one day to the next. So no clarity. Of course, France has its own multiple crises and is overwhelmed in its Africa sphere and so forth. So France out of this. Actually, we've heard some sensible words from Prime Minister Meloni in Italy. I was when she attended the forum in Cairo, and that was good to hear. We've heard some sensible things coming from the Spanish government, but this is not a government that it's not even in place right now after elections and still trying to form a coalition. Not a place where one can forge any kind of European leadership. Northern Europe just so completely overwhelmed, I suppose, with Ukraine and with their own crises, not a peep. So Europe plays no guiding role at all. And of course, Europe has a very substantial Muslim population, which is out on the streets protesting, which means that Europe falling in line with, if you could say, U.S. policy, there is no policy, but falling in line with the United States doesn't work at all. So Europe is adrift in this from a diplomatic point of view. Diplomacy has been awful during the whole Ukraine crisis, but it is even more awful and inconsequential now. But I would say one thing: Europe will not block in the UN Security Council or in the UN General Assembly clarity right now to push for a political solution. So Europe will not align automatically with the US, whatever the US leadership decides to do. Europe cannot and will not follow lockstep in that because perhaps unlike the Ukraine crisis, this isn't in the same way a security threat where the U.S. has to hide underneath the U.S. Umbrella, nuclear umbrella, but rather a case where Europe's own internal politics are so much at stake in the Middle East that somebody in Europe's going to have to think about Europe's interests and about ground realities right now. So I think Israel's not going to find any kind of support for this extraordinarily hardline position that Israel has taken, and is going to find itself isolated in that sense too among the European countries.